Oh! Oh! Oh!
Meow. Hey everyone, my name's Chris, and I just can't stop making things. Today I want to show you how I made a F16 remote control airplane out of dollar store foam board, and it weighs less than 250 grams, which is super important if you live in a country that has rules about airplanes and things. Lots of countries, 250 grams is the cutoff, where if you go above that, there's a whole bunch more registration and rules and stuff that you got to do. So if you can keep it under 250, super good. I also wanted to get as big a plane as I could so I could see it well while it's flying, because I'm not that good at flying remote control airplanes. So, want to see how I did it? Then watch this video. First, before we do anything, I want to give credit to Nick from nerdnick.com. The design I made is based off his F16 Chuck glider, which you can find among many more fantastic plans on his website, so be sure to check it out. I used his plans, scaled them up, altered them a bit, and printed them out. It's important they print at actual size, otherwise there's gonna be problems. I used a nearby window to tape them together so I could see through the pages and line up the alignment markings, being careful not to disturb the local wildlife also using the window. With my pattern taped together, I scurried away from the natural light into the darkness of my basement. Got out my scissors and started cutting. Some parts are easier to cut out with a knife, so I used a knife for those. I grabbed a couple sheets of Adam's Ready Board, which is a foam board you can get at Dollar Tree stores. And then I started tracing. I extended the dotted lines on the wings and connected them with a ruler once I removed the pattern. Most airplanes have two wings, so the pattern piece gets flipped over for the second one. I extended the dotted lines on the tail, used a pin to mark the control horn lines, and then made those marks into lines with a ruler. Or not a ruler. The dotted lines on the pattern are score lines, so you don't want to end up cutting all the way through, so it might be a good idea to mark them as dotted lines, which I didn't. All the pieces don't quite fit on one sheet of foam board, so I needed to use a second one to finish it off. It's a bit of a Tetris puzzle trying to fit all the pieces on the foam board, so if you want to see how I did mine, here it is. Alright, time to start cutting with a very sharp knife. I like to use a number 11 scalpel blade because it's skinny enough to go around the curves fairly easily. It's really important that your blade is super sharp, otherwise it's going to catch on the paper and kind of rip it as you cut, and it'll just look horrendous. Oh, and don't cut your fingers off. That would also look horrendous. Another great thing about the number 11 scalpel blade is it makes it really easy to make those short cuts at the end of those slots. Speaking of slots, I'm not going to cut the top part of the slot for the propeller. It'll just make the top half of the fuselage too weak for when I'm shoving the wing through there. I turned on my hot glue gun and grabbed a silicone baking sheet, because hot glue doesn't stick to silicone. I put a bead of hot glue on fuselage number 1 and glued it to fuselage number 2, immediately wiping the excess glue off with a piece of scrap foam board, because I'm trying to keep this build as light as possible. Next, the nose doubler goes on, lining it up with the rest of the nose and making sure the slot at the back lines up with the slot at the front of the wing. Flip it over and repeat for the other side, being firm yet gentle while holding it in the correct position. It's entirely possible I didn't get those front wing slots lined up perfectly, so I fixed them up with a bit of knife action. On the score cuts, which should be dotted lines but aren't, I cut through the top layer of paper and partway through the foam board on the first cut, then I flip my knife over so the not sharp side is down and drag it along that cut again, deepening the cut so it goes all the way through the foam but not through the bottom layer of paper. I then used a barbecue skewer to open up that crease even more by running it down the line a few times with quite a bit of force. This allows the leading edge of the wing to be folded up until it's possible to easily slide the camber gauge in at the end of the wing. I squeezed a small amount of glue down that seam, stuck in the camber gauge while holding the rest of the wing flat, wiped the excess glue off with a piece of scrap foam board, turning it regularly to gather as much glue as possible, and held it there until I was sure the glue was totally cooled. I had some tea while I waited. With both wings done, I added a bit of tape at the front and the back just to hold them together temporarily, which allows me to open up the center seam and blurrily glue along it, and then fold it back together so the glue surfaces connect. With one wing flat on the table, I lifted the other wing and slid in the dihedral gauge at the end. This gives it some dihedral, which helps it fly. Also, before the glue cools, the excess needs to be wiped away with some scrap. I folded over the little piece of tape at the back and cut away the little piece of tape at the front, and cut out the slot for the prop.
prop slot. I cut a random amount off the front point of the wing, and carefully and gently eased the wing in through the wing slot. I supported it from the back with my hand because the fuselage is still pretty prone to bending and breaking. I made sure the wing was centered along the fuselage and then slid it back until the propeller slots lined up. I made a light mark with a pencil on each side of the fuselage so I could move it over a little bit before I put my glue down and know where it was supposed to go back to. So I pushed it out of the way, put down a strip of glue, and then pushed it back so it was lined up between the two pencil marks. I reinforced that connection by running a bead of glue along the inside corners and then wiping as much as I could off with some scrap. I glued the horizontal nose piece into its slot, making sure the back angled section of it was well glued to the front of the wing, and repeated for the other side. I cut the score lines on the tail using the good old cut it once, not quite all the way through, then flip over your knife, and score the rest of the way through but not through the paper technique, leaving me with some nice flappy flaps. Well, actually not flaps, elevators. But they look like flaps. In order to make the flappy elevators so they can flap down, I need to get rid of some of the foam that's stopping it. So I cut a 45-degree angle right along that paper hinge, trying not to cut any of the paper but coming super close to it.
It's lunchtime, Dad!
Also, apparently it's lunchtime. I will say this takes a bit of practice and a really sharp knife, but you can always come back and cut a little bit more off if you need to. Once I had a freely flapping flap, I put a little bead of hot glue right down the center and then wiped off as much as possible. If I don't wipe off enough, the flap is not going to flap very flappily. You've got to let the glue totally cool before you start playing around with it, otherwise it might stick to itself and then it wouldn't flap very well. I also scored the control horn lines. I slid the tail in from the back to check the fit, and then pulled it out a little ways, put some glue on the sides of the fuselage and top of the tail, and then slid it back again. The tail doesn't line up exactly with the back of the wings because the wings have dihedral and the tail doesn't, but I just put some glue on that joint and then forced the tail up a little bit. It's important to hold that until the glue totally cools so it doesn't try and separate again. Alright, for the motor mount I would normally use a 3D printed one, but there's a lot of people who don't have 3D printers, so I'm going to make a foam motor mount for this one. I hope it works. I scored the score lines, folded the foam back to expose the strip, and then nibbled it away with my nibbling fingers, like a tiny little mouse eating some foam and then throwing it on the table. This makes it so the side edges can fold over the top piece, giving me a nice little 3/4 of a box. Squirt some glue along the seams and then hold it down on the table against a square to make sure it stays square. For the firewall, I used a paddle from one of those kids' ball and paddle games, you know, the ones that no one ever really uses. It's made from thin plywood, and it's way cheaper than buying hobby store plywood. In fact, it's free if you steal it from your kids, like I did. I drilled a bunch of holes, and then used my jeweler's saw to cut it all out. If you've never used a jeweler's saw, it's an awesome tool, kinda like a laser cutter, but more work, and no lasers. I glued the firewall onto the motor mount, and then used some packing tape to wrap it like a little present. The packing tape adds tons of strength to the whole thing. If you need more detailed information about any of the processes I'm using, you should totally check out Flight Test. That's where I learned pretty much everything I know about making airplanes from foam. And they have tons of free plans too. Just tell Josh Pixler I say hi. I used a knife to continue the angle on the motor mount, just to make it look nice, and then glued in the internal motor mount pieces, lining up the back edge with the back edge of the motor mount. I glued the motor mount support pieces on each side of the fuselage, lining them up with the random bump that isn't on any F16 I've ever seen in my life. I want the motor mount to fit down over that section, so it'll need a bit of trimming on the inside so it can slide down on there. Basically, I just cut those two internal pieces in half, and that leaves it fitting beautifully onto the fuselage. I cut away the slot for the propeller, and that's the foam part of the plane done. If you're wondering how much it weighs at this point, it weighs approximately 122 grams. Alright, now it's time to add all the other components that make it fly. I used a 50-30 propeller, an Emax MT1806 motor, a BL Heli 12-amp ESC, 2 generic 9-gram servos, and a FlySky FS IA6 receiver to go along with my FlySky transmitter. FlySky. I glued some control horns in the control horn slots, centered my 9-gram servos, bent some servo wires so that the straight part between the bends was 27.5 centimeters, and inserted the servo wires in the control horns. Flap, flap. A small zip tie around the servo wire so it doesn't bend weirdly when there's pressure put on it. Cut off the zip tie with a little bit of a tail and jam it in the foam. Then take it out and glue it back in. I sanded the back of the servo so the hot glue would stick to it, slid it onto the servo wire, and then glued it down to the bottom of the wing, making sure to hold it in exactly the right place until the glue cools, so the elevators stay nice and flat with the rest of the tail. I used a straight piece of foam board just to help me see what flat looks like. I jammed the motor wires through a hole in the firewall and screwed the motor in through the holes. The wires come out of the motor mount through the little gap at the front. I tested the motor mount to make sure the propeller would fit through the slot, which it did. Hot glued a little piece of fuzzy Velcro on the side for the receiver, and a longer piece near the front of the fuselage on the other side for the battery. Quick note, I did end up moving the Velcro farther forward because the plane was a tiny bit tail heavy. The ESC is going to be taped on the same side as the receiver, so I need to make a hole through the top of the wing to attach it to the motor connections. Did a bit of awkward wire fishing. If the motor ends up spinning the wrong directions, I can just switch any two of those connections and it'll go the other way. Quick safety note, don't ever attach a battery with the prop on the motor, unless you're actually flying the plane, then it's a good idea. I punched another hole just below the front point of the wing and jammed the battery connection of the ESC through there. I used a little stick to get it all the way through. One more slot just above the receiver for the servo that's on the opposite side. So you can see we've got the battery, which then connects to the ESC, which connects to both the motor and the receiver is also connected to the two servos. And that should make the plane fly. I hope. I still had a few grams to play with before I hit 250, so I thought, might as well give it a paint job. I thinned some acrylic craft paint with water, grabbed my airbrush, and started spraying. Now if the paper gets too wet, it's going to separate from the foam, so I did extremely light coats, letting it dry completely before recoating. Kind of a long, annoying process that I never really do, but I kind of wanted it to look nice for the video. A little bit of blue for the cockpit, and a black nose. After painting, the plane weighed 244 grams. For some wingtip detail, I made a little template and used a black marker to fill that in. The nice thing about markers is they don't add very much weight at all. The not as nice thing about markers is it looks like you drew on it with a marker. I did almost forget that it's important to attach the motor to the plane somehow, so I pushed some barbecue skewers through the motor mount, holding it onto the fuselage. I did some fancy taping to make sure the servo wires would stay out of the way of the propeller, and everything else was just generally tidy. I also added some packing tape where the wings and nose met the tail, just for a bit of extra strength in those weaker areas. Lastly, I checked to make sure the propeller spun in the right direction, and that the control surfaces were also moving in the right directions. Now all that was left was to go for a fly.
Let's kick some tires and light some fires.
Hey, let's try, can we try with you throwing it up, launching it upside down and see if it'll fly?
Okay.
Okay, Sam's gonna launch it upside down to see if it upside down flies. You hold it upside down when you launch it.
Okay. What about the?
Are you ready, everyone?
I'm ready.
Are you
Ready.
Here we go.
Oh! Oh! Well,
It flew until you crashed straight into the ground.
Because I was trying to make it go up, but my mind thought it was right side up, but it was upside down. So when you make it go up, that makes it go down. How was I supposed to get it to go up?
You
do the
pull back.
opposite.
That was already
I mean,
pulled all the way
pull,
back.
Pull.
That was already pulled all the way.
Oh, then I guess you don't.
Let's see if it's damaged, everyone. I feel like the propeller came out.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, that would be.
So
the
we had a
general
propeller coming
feeling.
out. We somehow cut this, I think by the propeller hitting it. And there's a bit of nose crunchage.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, look, that's kind of broken.
yeah.
We have a little bit of fixing up to do. Nothing a little bit of hot glue can't fix. That's what happens when you fly upside down and then crash it straight into the ground.
Yes.
Who knew? Good job, everyone. I think we did kick some tires and we did light some fires.
100%.
Not literally, but
Right.
metaphorically.
We metaphorically kicked some tires and lit some metaphorical fires. And crashed some noses and broke some. But look, we crashed, but we didn't actually break our propeller, which is what we used to do every time we crashed.
Yeah, back
Because
in
the
the day
propeller's
when we
in the
had
back, not the front.
on the front.
This front is this is all just crumple zone up here. It's not going to damage anything.
Yeah.
Boom.
Airplane. Under 250 grams. And that's how much fun you can have for under 250 grams. Like, we didn't do terrible damage.
No, I think it was really good.
If
that
I
was
hadn't
really
tried
successful.
something stupid, this would be still totally fine.
It's worth
That's
it for
what-
the experimentation.
That's what science is for. All right, time for a wrap up, I suppose. Actually, truth be told, that video you just saw was footage that I filmed 2 years ago and never got around to editing. And I just found, well, I did actually edit most of it. I just found it on my hard drive and it was mostly edited except for this last little talking bit. So here I am doing the talking bit. So since it's been 2 years and we've flown these planes a few times since that video, I guess I have some things to say about them. These are great planes. I think they're one of my favorite planes to fly. They're probably pretty much as big as you can make a plane that's still under 250 grams. In fact, the second one I made even lighter using lighter servos and a lighter receiver. And that meant I had enough weight savings to mount a little tiny camera on the back and still be under 250 grams. So that's pretty cool. You do need to fly them, however, on a day that there's hardly any wind because the surface area to weight ratio or something is pretty high, which means that the wind has a lot of action on the plane because the plane is so light and so big. However, what I liked about it being light and big is that I can see it in the sky because my eyes are getting old because I'm getting old. I found these planes really good for teaching people how to fly RC because they can fly slow. They don't tend to stall that much, it seems, and propeller's in the middle, so when it crashes nose down, boom, it doesn't destroy your propeller, and then you have to keep buying new propellers. What else? The second plane, I did end up adding a servo in the middle to give it some ailerons, which I haven't really tried that much yet, so I don't really know if it's good or bad. I think they need to be a little bigger. I have noticed that the weak points on this plane are where the wing attaches to the this thing here, whatever that's called. So I've added tape on both sides, as well as where the wing connects to this front fuselage bit. Those are both places that tend to break when you crash it, sometimes. The other thing is in the plans I've made, the slot for the tail kind of angles up a little bit, which actually means that to fly straight, you need to trim these thingamajiggers down. So actually, if I was to redo the pattern, I would actually bring that slot more parallel with the line of the fuselage. So I don't know if I'll get around to doing that or not, but that might be something you might want to think of. However, with it kicked up like that, it makes this a really good chuck glider if you don't put any electronics or propellery things on it. Then that is actually the perfect for making it go as a glider. You just need a bit of weight up here, a little bit of plasticine right here, and boom, you've got a really fun little glider to throw around. Anything else? He asks himself. Oh yeah, so again, big thanks to Nerd Nick from nerdnick.com. He has plans for a chuck glider, which is a smaller scale. It's about this long, but I basically took those plans, blew them up, added some stuff, and changed a few things, and made a new set of plans for making this. So if you want to grab the original chuck glider plans, check out Nerd Nick's site. If you want to grab these plans, I'll have them on my website. I'll put a link in the description or in the video. I know my website is all about costume making, so just probably scroll to the bottom of the page and I'll have a link to where you can get the files to print this out yourself. Anyways, I just wanted to share that with you and get that pattern out there because this plane is really a lot of fun and it's under 250 grams, which makes it even better because you don't have to do a bunch of stuff depending on what country you're in. I'm in Canada and 250 grams is the magic number. So have fun, go fly an airplane somewhere safely and funly. All right, thanks for watching. See ya. We're doing formation flying.
Yes, we are very
Which means-
accomplished at it.
If we can get within 40 feet of each other and go in the same direction, we've achieved our goal.
Yeah.
I'd say,
Yeah.
because we're just not that good. I'm coming behind you.
Oh, I was coming behind you
Okay.
right then.
I'm just going slow. We're in formation.